researchers who are studying virtual reality as an object typically want to compare virtual reality to something else to see how people behave in virtual reality compared to how they behave in a different situation. And I think it's important to make a distinction here between two types of studies, if you will, that study virtual reality as an object in itself. One type of study, one line of research, really compares then virtual reality to the real world. So you study how people behave in the real world, or you more or less know how people behave in the real world. And then you look at how people behave in virtual reality, in virtual environments. And then you compare those two. So for instance, you look at how people talk to each other. In the real world, you analyze this, for instance, by videotaping natural conversations between people. And then you make them have a certain conversation with a virtual agent or with an avatar in VR. And see whether that's the same or whether it's different, whether they start behaving differently. Another type of comparison that's often made is between virtual reality and different types of media. So for instance, you can compare how people behave, how people treat virtual reality, how they treat virtual environments, and compare this to, for instance, how they interact, how they behave if they're watching a video on a computer screen. Or you compare this to what happens if they're watching television. Or you perhaps compare how they behave in a fully immersive virtual reality environment compared to how they behave if they observe digital objects through augmented reality. So those two cases are sort of distinct, where it is good to keep in mind that if you're comparing VR to the real world, typically then you will try to mimic the real world in VR. Whereas it's also possible, of course, to create virtual environments that allow you to do things that are not possible in the real world, right? So in virtual reality, you may be flying yourself, whereas in the real world, this is not possible. So then it's really hard to compare VR to the real world. If you're comparing virtual reality to a different medium, then the question typically is, does VR offer you something more than a traditional medium? Does it offer you more, for instance, as a researcher, when you're immersing people in 3D virtual environment compared to when you're showing them a video on a computer screen? And this second type of research that's often being carried out very often looks at presence, because this might be something that VR has to offer that traditional methods, media don't have to offer. So the assumption is people will most likely feel more present in a virtual environment in 3D when they're wearing a headset, for instance, compared to when they're watching a video on a computer screen. And this is something you can very easily test by a so-called presence questionnaire. So there are a couple of different of those presence questionnaires. Sometimes also students use them in their master's research. So you make one group of people have one certain type of experience. For instance, they experience a virtual world in 3D. They can really look around, interact with this virtual world, walk through this virtual world. And then afterwards, you ask them questions like, you give them some statements like, I felt I was visiting the places in the displayed environment. And then you give them some kind of scale from 1 to 5. Again, you ask them later on, you give them this statement, I had a sense of being in the scenes displayed. Again, you give them a scale from 1 to 5. So you can measure their sense of presence, their subjective sense of presence during the experience they just had. And you compare this to a different group that perhaps saw the same things, but in 2D on a computer screen. Or you show them a video of something on a television. And then you can test by giving them those same questions, those same statements. Does VR really add something? Do people feel more present in those environments when they experience them in 3D compared to when they just more passively perhaps watch them on a computer screen or a television screen? So this is the second type of research in which VR is used as an object. So notice that this is quite different to comparing VR to the real world, right? So there you need to sort of find a real world behavior that's similar to the behavior that you're inducing in VR and compare it in a different way, for instance, by looking at people's behavior. So you know how people behave in the real world because this you analyzed before, or you took this from previous research. Then you see how they behave in a virtual environment, and you just compare those two. A bit different from this second type of approach, where you, for instance, when you're a researcher focusing on presence, compare like via a questionnaire how people now sort of felt immersed or not, in this VR environment that you're offering.